All right, thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio, my friend, Mr. Turner, seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise pursuant to H.Res. 199. I call up Senate Bill 619 to require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information relating to the origins of COVID-19 and for other purposes, and ask for immediate considerations in the House.
The clerk will now report the title of the bill.
Senate 619, an act to require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information relating to the origin of COVID-19 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 199, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence or their respective designees. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, and the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Haines, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and insert into the record extraneous material on S619.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of S619, a bill that would require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information relating to the origin of COVID-19. The House companion bill, H.R. 1376, passed unanimously out of the Intelligence Committee. I want to thank my ranking member Haines for his dedication to bipartisanship and to professionalism as we work together to try to ensure that the Intelligence Committee responds to the needs of the House. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc across the country, with almost every household feeling its effects. The United States death toll from this virus has surpassed 1 million people. Although concrete data is hard to lock down, millions of Americans are suffering from the long-term effects directly attributed to this virus. COVID-19 has also negatively affected our communities, especially our kids. It is becoming increasingly clear that school-aged children face major educational hurdles because of distance learning and long-term school closures. The American public deserves answers to every aspect of COVID-19 pandemic, including how this virus was created and specifically whether it was a natural occurrence or was the result of a lab-related event. The House Intelligence Committee, which oversees our intelligence community, is aware of classified information that could help inform the public why COVID-19 as a lab leak theory is not just a possibility, but approaches the idea that it is likely. The intelligence community does have more information about COVID-19 than the public is led to believe. Much of the information they have can be declassified and disseminated to the public. In fact, the bill we are discussing today would give the American public just a glimpse, albeit a very important aspect of the classified information the intelligence community holds. S619, if passed by the House and signed into law, would give the American public a unique insight as to what was happening at a biosafety level laboratory in Wuhan, China, in late 2019 and early 2020. This laboratory and who was working there might be the key to unraveling the truth. For those concerned about declassifying COVID-19 origins information, I can assure you that the intelligence community could release this information while protecting their sources and methods of how it was collected. In fact, I believe that the intelligence community could go further than what is called for in S619 and release most of what it knows about COVID origins, but this is a good start. COVID-19 ranks as one of this century's most important events. No community was spared, and every corner of the world felt its effects. Everyone deserves to know what our intelligence community knows about, and S619 is the right step in the right direction. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of S619, the COVID-19 Origins Act of 2023. Along with my colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, I plan to support this legislation, and I urge the House to pass it. And let me stop now to compliment Chairman Turner on the efforts he has made narrowly to bring this bill to the floor, but more generally to make sure that the Intelligence Committee operates in the thoughtful, constructive, and bipartisan manner which it must operate in if we are to protect this nation's national security. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken the lives of more than 1.1 million Americans, and millions more have died worldwide. The American people want to know as much as we can determine about where this pandemic started and, critically, how we can be ready for the next deadly disease, which will come. Determining the precise origins of a pandemic disease with high confidence is challenging under the best of circumstances. In this case, our already difficult task is that much harder because COVID originated in China. At every juncture, the PRC government has obfuscated and obstructed legitimate inquiries and investigations into the origins of the disease. China's approach has been deeply irresponsible and dangerous to global public health. It is against that backdrop that in 2021, President Biden ordered a 90-day sprint by the intelligence community to analyze the origins of the virus. In August of 2021, the IC completed its initial work, and a few months later, a declassified version of its findings was made public. In short, the intelligence community agencies could not come to an agreement on whether the virus originated from a lab accident or from natural exposure. Some individual agencies did reach a judgment, a narrow judgment, about which path was more likely, but they could not do so with high confidence simply because we don't have enough reliable information to draw those conclusions. There's a version of the IC's classified assessment that is available to all members through the House Security Office. Around 18 months after the completion of the IC assessment, not much has changed. The intelligence community remains focused on this question, and I hope that we will have a breakthrough that will allow us to answer these questions once and for all, but today we're not there yet. I believe that the IC should make as much public as they can, consistent with the overriding need to protect sources and methods. Transparency is a critical element of our democracy. The factual grounding of the IC's analysis can be an antidote to the speculation, the rumor, and the theories that grow in the absence of good information. It's important to note that the bill provides the authority to make redaction to protect sources and methods for a good reason, and neither the chairman nor I would be supporting the bill if that were not true. I trust the intelligence community and administration will lean forward in making public as much new information as possible without endangering our ability to collect and analyze on these issues going forward. Now, I want to mention, before I stop and recognize other speakers on my side, two important things. First, the pandemic, which is really what is at stake here. Whether COVID-19 originated from a lab leak or natural transmission at a wet market, the next pandemic disease could originate from either source, and it could come from anywhere. In 2022, the Intelligence Committee released a declassified report looking at how the intelligence community responded to COVID-19 and making recommendations for how we can be better prepared for the next pandemic disease, wherever it may come from. Overall, the report recommended that the intelligence community increase resources for global health security and medical intelligence, and that it needs to move away from a culture that views health security as a lesser priority than so-called traditional hard national security threats, evidence the fact that it was this that killed over 1 million Americans. Furthermore, we need to promote complementary efforts between the public health and intelligence communities. Public health professionals and their counterparts in the IC must work hand in hand if we want to maximize the odds of identifying a novel disease at the earliest possible stage, and if we want to give ourselves the best chance of determining the novel disease's origins. Let me turn briefly to another important thing that is really at stake here. Madam Speaker, democracy is rooted in the idea that the people govern, that is their right to determine their own political destiny. But with that right comes an obligation that we don't talk about or think about nearly enough. And that obligation is to be thoughtful, informed, critical thinkers about the issues of the day. And that's not who we are today. Today we have elevated, because of our political polarization, we have elevated confirmation bias to a secular religion. So even in this conversation about the origins of the coronavirus, what you believe is indicative of where you stand on the political spectrum. For reasons I don't understand, some of our colleagues and many Americans are running around with a theory that somehow buttresses their political legitimacy. Maybe you do that with UFOs. Maybe you want to believe that there's aliens at Roswell or whatever you want to believe. That's pretty harmless. But when we're talking about a pandemic or something as serious as a disease that could kill 1 million Americans, that's not okay. And we have to remember our obligation to be thoughtful, critical thinkers. We cannot let our political hopes override the obligations we have to be thinkers. And colleagues, I will tell you, the chairman and I have seen all of the classified information on this, and we don't know. We don't know the origins of the COVID pandemic. So whatever is ultimately declassified, I would hope that my colleagues and the American people would approach that information with the humility, the intellectual humility that we need to approach something as serious as a pandemic and how we behave as citizens in a democracy. We don't know. We need to think about whether we want confirmation bias, our tendency to select just those facts which support our pre-existing positions, interfere with our duty as critical thinkers in a democracy. At the end of the day, the American people will get the system of government that they deserve. And if we don't get back to being humble about what we know, to being critical thinkers, our democracy will be at risk. I want to close with a quote from a great Connecticut writer and humorist, Mark Twain. He said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So I'm going to join my chairman in supporting this bill, and I hope it passes in overwhelming bipartisan fashion, and I hope we take that information and use it for constructive purposes in the service of saving lives and buttressing our democracy. Madam Speaker, with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Ohio is now recognized.
I appreciate my ranking member's very thoughtful comments and remarks. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the congressman from California, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Mr. Chairman. The issue at hand is actually a simple one. It's whether or not to declassify data pertaining to the investigations into the origins of COVID. This is a simple vote. But the simplicity of this vote is in stark contrast to the magnitude of the ramifications of this declassification process. By declassifying, we will be able to seek clarity, give transparency, and gain security, which is what the American people deserve. By declassifying, we have a chance to ensure that 7 million people who died of COVID are honored correctly. This is a chance to hold China accountable for COVID and seek justice and a reckoning. And perhaps most importantly, a chance to prevent another man-made pandemic such as this from wreaking havoc on the planet again. I think it's shameful that some have politicized this issue. This isn't political at all. Declassifying this information is simply the right thing to do. I've personally been cleared to handle classified information since I was 18 years old, and the point of classifying information is to protect American lives, whether it's civilians and/or military personnel. Information that is classified as material that would cause damage, serious damage, or exceptionally grave damage to national security if made publicly available. And now the irony of this debate, however, is that the release of this data will actually save lives and help prevent the loss of life in the future. It will enhance our security, not degrade it. But the continued overclassification of this data at the highest level actually poses the greatest threat to our nation's security. So this is an easy and simple yes vote. But the implications of this will determine whether or not we are able to prevent such another catastrophic pandemic from paralyzing us and taking so many lives. I encourage all members from both sides of the aisle to vote yes and enable us to get to the bottom of this, hold China accountable, and defend us against any future CCP threats. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to Dr. Barra of California, a member of the Select Committee on the Coronavirus.
The gentleman from California is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the ranking member and the chairman of the House Select Committee on Intelligence. This should be an easy vote, because this is just about science. It's about understanding the origins of this virus that created this pandemic, that took at a minimum 7 million lives, probably many more than that. It's just about science. We're not debating the geography of where this virus originated. We know that. But we're debating how this novel virus evolved. Like, this is a brand new virus, and that should go without question. So I hope this is a strong yes vote by both Democrats and Republicans. I think about this as a doctor and a scientist, someone who spent a lot of my time in Congress looking at global health security, looking at pandemic preparedness. I'm proud to serve on the select committee that is looking at coronavirus and the impact of this pandemic. My colleague, another physician, Dr. Wenstrup, is the chairman of that committee, and the ranking member is Dr. Raul Ruiz, who, again, I think if we can take the politics out of this, we can actually understand what happened over these past 3 years, the impact it had not just on the United States, but on the entire world. And we can work together as Democrats and Republicans and hopefully the global scientific community to prevent the next pandemic. That's what this is about. Now, I don't know if we'll ever find those origins if the Chinese Communist Party doesn't work with us. They've got to allow the best scientists in the world. It's in their interest as well, because they've suffered greatly. The Chinese people have suffered greatly from this pandemic. They ought to allow the best scientists in the world to go into ground zero, to the hot zone, to Wuhan, and try to understand how this virus evolved. Maybe it was a wet market. Maybe it was a lab leak. It's important for us to understand what it was, because that then will allow us to address and shore up the system. If it was a lab leak, we ought to have the highest safety standards in the world if we're doing this kind of research. We ought to look at whether we should do gain-of-function research. That's a legitimate question. There's a scientific debate about that, et cetera. But if it is a lab leak, we ought to understand that. We ought to come together as a global community and make sure we have the highest standards. If it was a wet market, if this was a naturally occurring virus that came from an animal into a human, we ought to understand that as well. We ought to put in the safety and the precautions to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. Let's take the politics out of it. Today, we've got a chance as the United States Congress to take a big vote, Democrats and Republicans, to say, let's try to figure out what happened. It affected all of us. And we ought to do everything we can as the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans, as a global scientific community to prevent this from happening again in our lifetime and hopefully ever again. So I urge my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to vote yes on this bill. It will allow us to share information with the public because, again, this affected all of us, and I hope we have a strong yes vote on the COVID origins bill. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Connecticut yields back, and the gentleman from Ohio is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the Congressman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill is the beginning of transparency Americans deserve regarding COVID's entry into our nation, a virus that's killed more than 1 million of our loved ones here at home and millions more across the world. Our colleagues on the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic will piece together all the facts and share them with the public, including the role played by elements of our government and the media to try and discredit those who told the truth about COVID. This bill is focused on safe disclosure of what our intelligence agencies have learned about the central role foreign actors had on the creation and spread of this deadly virus. It's important that Americans and others across the globe learn about the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up of COVID's origins at its Wuhan research facility, as well as the World Health Organization's subsequent role in suppressing this truth until China and others who echoed China's false narrative face accountability and consequences for that. We're just inviting the next cover-up. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
I reserve.
All right, the gentleman from Connecticut reserves, and the gentleman from Ohio is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the Congressman from Mississippi, Trent Kelly.
The congressman from Mississippi is now recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to encourage members to support passage of Senate Bill 619, a bill that requires the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information related to the origin of COVID-19. The need for transparency regarding the origin of this pandemic cannot be overstated, especially as the world continues to grapple with its effect. Thank you, Chairman Turner, for your leadership on this issue, and thank you to the Senate's Intelligence Committee for their diligent work. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's chaotic response has had a devastating impact on our nation and the world, and it has caused loss of life, disrupted our economy, and fundamentally changed our way of life. We owe it to the American people to inform them where this virus originated and how. Republican members charged with oversight have always been champions of transparency and accountability. By supporting this bill, we are showing the American people that we take this responsibility seriously. Republicans are keeping their promise to do everything within our power to get the truth and hold those responsible accountable. To date, the source of virus remains unclear, and there are strong indications that it may have originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. The American people deserve answers. They deserve to know the truth about the origin of this pandemic. Without transparency, the public will turn to malign actors for information, further undermining our citizens' trust in the government and its intelligence agency. As we know, trust is a vital component of any successful democracy. When citizens do not trust their government, it destabilizes society and strains the fabric that binds our communities together. The intelligence community has a responsibility to provide the American people with accurate information that can help them make informed decisions. By declassifying the information on COVID-19, the DNI can help restore the public's trust in our intelligence community. In conclusion, I urge you to support passage of Senate Bill S619. It's our duty to the American people to do everything within our power to get to the truth, and this bill is an important step in that direction. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Connecticut reserves, and the gentleman from Ohio is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the congressman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Like millions of people around the world, in 2020 I tested positive for COVID. I was fortunate. After several days in the hospital and 14 days on oxygen, I was able to recover. Many were not. Americans and the rest of the world deserve to know exactly where this virus started and any details surrounding the origins of the virus that launched the globe into chaos. If the CCP was not fully transparent during these times, people need to know that as well. How long did they cover it up? How long did they know that this virus had been unleashed? If we're going to defeat the Communist Chinese Party, our government has to be transparent about how malicious they have become. And the U.S. and other freedom-loving nations are going to have to join together to make sure that we expose their intents to the world. I believe that we all have the right to know about the origins of COVID-19, and I urge my colleagues to support this resolution to require the Director of the National Intelligence to declassify any of the information that we have on the origins of COVID and the CCP. Thank you, Ms. I yield.
Ohio reserves.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Connecticut is now
Reserves.
recognized. The gentleman from Connecticut now reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the congressman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
The gentleman from Utah is now recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. And again, I would like to thank the chairman and the majority or the minority leader for their supports on this. In April of 2020, so just months into the pandemic, we had a briefing from various agencies on the Intel Committee about the origins of the pandemic, and at that point, one of the agencies said to us, we know this did not come from the Wuhan lab. And many of us were angry at that. We said to them, how could you possibly know that? And the truth is, they didn't know that. The American people deserve to know the truth. Throughout the pandemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci has consistently said, anyone who would even propose this idea, that it came from the lab or some other source that was manufactured in China, was nothing but a conspiracy theory. He belittled anyone who suggested that. They tried to silence anyone who suggested that. And he advocated among his fellow scientists to do the same thing. Again, the American people deserve to know the truth. And I would defy anyone to give me any possible explanation why they would oppose this bill. This isn't like the movies. You can't handle the truth. The American people, of course, can handle the truth. They deserve to know the truth. And this final thought, even now, NIH is still listing the Wuhan Institute for eligibility to receive our federal tax dollars. That makes no sense at all. It's absolute nonsense. But we can't do that until, once again, we know the truth. I encourage support for this bill, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Connecticut reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The issue of the origins of COVID are so important that our Speaker has appointed a select committee on the origins of COVID. Our next Speaker, Dr. Winstrup, is the chair of that committee. I yield 3 minutes to Dr. Winstrup.
Is recognized.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of Senate Bill S619, the COVID-19 Origin Act. The American people deserve answers on the origins of the COVID-19 virus, a novel coronavirus that sparked a pandemic and has killed nearly 7 million people worldwide to date. The impact of the pandemic on the American people has been catastrophic. We lost loved ones. Everyone's been touched. Our physicians, nurses, and healthcare workers were strained beyond capacity. We had to contend with lockdowns, school closures, resulting learning loss, as well as shutdowns and job loss, and the depression and suicide that spiked after these measures. Many Americans still suffer physically, mentally, and economically from the impact of the virus and the measures taken during the pandemic. This bill will provide some sunlight for the American people and for scientists and for physicians. I am honored to be one of 7 physicians on the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, as Dr. Barra had referenced earlier. But in order for us to be able to predict, prepare, protect, and prevent against a future pandemic, we need to know how and where this pandemic began. And there are sound reasons to conclude that this particular virus may have resulted from a lab leak in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In the fall of 2019, well before Americans were aware of a problem in Wuhan, 4 unusual things happened at the Wuhan lab. Multiple researchers became sick with COVID-19-like symptoms, according to a State Department fact sheet. The Wuhan Institute deleted sequences of viruses that they had in their library. They changed control of the lab from civilian to military, highly unusual, and had a contractor redo the ventilation system in the laboratory. Furthermore, we know the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting gain-of-function research on novel bat coronaviruses by creating chimeric viruses, combining 2 viruses together to test infectivity and creating them and infecting mice with these viruses for study, and that the Wuhan lab had applied to receive U.S. grant funding in order to insert what's called the furin cleavage site into novel coronaviruses, the same unique genetic aspect of COVID-19 that made it more infectious to humans. Last Congress, I was honored to lead the House Intelligence Committee Republicans in producing our second interim report on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. This Congress, I'm fortunate to continue this work as the chairman of the Select Subcommittee, where we will work on a bipartisan basis to follow the facts, conduct a fair investigation, and seek to deliver the truth to the American people. This bill we are voting on today to declassify information on the origins of COVID-19 virus will provide much-needed transparency for Americans who have lost so much in this tragedy. But it's only a start. So I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in this endeavor. Madam Speaker, I urge the support of this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Connecticut reserves, and the gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the Congressman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
The gentleman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of S619, a bill to require the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to declassify all information related to potential leaks between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the origins of COVID-19. We had red flags from COVID's origins from day one. If it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Folks, this screams like a duck. In January of 2020, Dr. Fauci received emails that promulgated that COVID-19 looked engineered and not from the wild. Yet 3 weeks later, to save his own skin, he commissioned a scientific paper which, quote, debunked the lab theory. He was academically and intellectually dishonest. Why? He did not want the American people to know the truth. The truth is that Dr. Fauci and his institution funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money to promote dangerous gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology without proper guardrails. That is the key. The Wuhan lab was no more set up to deal with this deadly virus than my mother's kitchen. We had people, thousands, millions of people, lose their lives, their livelihoods, and their loved ones. This contagion leaked from the lab, and if that is the case, the world deserves to know. It is time to call out the duck in the room, release the intelligence that we need to find out the truth. We have been lied to by China. We have even been lied to by our own government leaders. We need the truth. I yield back. We ask our colleagues to please pass this bill.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Connecticut is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we were doing pretty well there, but behind the discussion of ducks were some pretty aggressive accusations of lying of American government officials, dishonesty, attributions of motives, which is what I'm really, and I think what we're all trying to avoid here. I'll say it again, as profoundly frustrating as it is, we just don't know. And we're entitled to have theories. We're citizens, after all. But we shouldn't be so certain in those theories that we're willing to impugn the character and motives of other Americans, especially if those Americans are in positions of responsibility that need to be trusted in the next pandemic. So I'll leave that there, but I do want to characterize and substantiate my rather frustrating observation that we just don't know with what the intelligence community believes is the latest assessment on the origins. And again, I understand this is frustrating, but facts are important. Here it is, and this is a publicly available document, but 4 intelligence community elements and the National Intelligence Council assess with low confidence that the virus was likely caused by natural exposure to animals infected with it. One IC element assesses with moderate confidence that the first human infection most likely was the result of a laboratory-associated incident. And then analysts at 3 IC elements remain unable to coalesce around either explanation. So that's a profoundly frustrating picture of organizations whose, in the aggregate budget, is tens of billions of dollars, who draw on all kinds of expertise, and yes, who are fallible, like any human institutions are. That's where they are, and sadly, that aggregates to we just don't know. And we're entitled to speculate, we're entitled to have theory, but I would just urge caution about impugning people's motives, imputing their character based on those theories, which are necessarily rooted in uncertainty. With that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Connecticut reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the Congressman from Georgia, Dr. McCormick.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's about time. It's good to see a bill actually shed some light on a disease process. If we want to expose something, if we want to bring the truth, this should have been done a long time ago. When we first started seeing this disease in the emergency department, and I was there on the front lines seeing people with fevers for no reason, testing negative for flu, testing negative for strep, pneumonia, urinary tract infections. We couldn't figure out why they were sick. We were sending them home, not really understanding what was wrong with them. And then we had a hard time figuring out how to treat them, and went through a novel disease process, just like they did back in 1918 when we had the original flu pandemic, where 20 million people died in about a year. It should never come to a point where we become politically motivated, and more to the point of why we become so critical of people who should be trusted is when they have bias built into their argument to begin with. And that's what we're here to expose. When we have transparency, when we have declassified information so we can actually make a good judgment based on public opinion when it's exposed to the truth, I think it will expose that people were politically motivated, that they were embarrassed by their choices, and that they made choices to politicize this rather than get to the bottom of this. We cannot stop a disease by misunderstanding where it came from. We cannot have an honest discussion and heal our nation until we have accountability. And I think where the mistrust comes from is the fact that it was made politicized to begin with. And so I think it's fair criticism when you have emails that expose the fact that they were trying to spin it a certain way rather than having honest scientific discussion, that's fair criticism. And people should be held accountable if we're going to get to the bottom of this. And as an ER doctor who served the entire pandemic, since before we even knew what it was, watching people die in front of me, learning lessons, and those are honest lessons where doctors made decisions and in good faith made mistakes. But it was in good faith. And we wanted to expose those people who made decisions out of bad faith. And with that, I yield.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves, and the gentleman from Connecticut is recognized. The gentleman from Connecticut reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized again.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the Congressman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, for nearly 3 years now, the truth about COVID-19 and its origins have been hidden from the American people. We're at a real crossroads here. There should not be a single partisan fight over this issue. I mean, we're talking about the lives of so many people, not only in our country, but also throughout the rest of the world. Unfortunately, big government bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci abuse their positions of power to disguise and distort the facts and to further a tyrannical approach to our country. And anyone who dared ask the question about the origins of COVID or chose to make an independent healthcare decision for their own family were silenced, censored, and ostracized as conspiracy theorists. Lo and behold, we stand here today with so many of these truths that were previously called conspiracy theories turning out to be true. The most glaring example being that Fauci knew as early as March of 2020 that coronavirus leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. And he spent the next 3 years dodging, misleading, mischaracterizing the possibility, and even using American taxpayer dollars to pay for studies to discredit that very thing. This is not just unfortunate. This is truly astonishing. And we wonder why the American people have a lack of trust in our government. It's because of these kinds of things. My constituents deserve to know the truth. Everyone that is here, their constituents deserve to know the truth. And Republicans delivered a commitment to America that we would deliver accountability, that we would have a government that is accountable. And it starts with things like this. We shouldn't fear government institutions. We should not fear the decisions that are made. But when you hide things and you mischaracterize things and you mislead the public, we do. And that's part of our commitment to America, is to uncover those things and make it accountable and transparent, to put things on the table and let people know the facts.
Is it over?
And that accountability is going to have to be for the lives that were lost, the livelihoods that were destroyed, and the years together that families were robbed of. Pass this bill, declassify this information, and let's get the truth. Okay. I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I have no more speakers. I'm prepared to close.
All right, the gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'll reiterate my support for this bill and my gratitude to the chairman and the Republican majority for moving it quickly. This bill fundamentally is about something we haven't talked a lot about today, which is transparency. Transparency is a cornerstone of our democracy, because without transparency, the American people can't make the decisions that they need to make responsibly as citizens of a democracy. I'm sorry that we heard a little bit today accusations that the truth was hidden from the American people, that taxpayer funds were misused, that Dr. Fauci had a motive to cover himself, that there was government censorship. There's not one iota of evidence for any of that. And when we say those things without evidence, what we do is we reduce the American people's faith in their government. And eventually, when their faith in their government is reduced to nothing, we lose our democracy. Or we see people breaking windows downstairs to get into the government's chambers because it has been so discredited. But I'm going to set that aside right now because this is an important bipartisan effort to bring transparency around something that's going to be pretty frustrating for the American people, because no matter what's declassified, it won't be dispositive about the origins of the coronavirus. So this is a really important first step. I hope it will clear up some of the speculation, some of the rumors that are out there. And it is emblematic of something that the chairman and I care a lot about, which is that unless there's a really good reason to keep something classified, the American people are responsible enough to have that information. So with that, I'll thank again Chairman Turner for his work on this issue, for his commitment to bipartisanship, urge support from the whole House for S619, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Connecticut yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I want to begin by thanking my ranking member. This bill comes to the House floor from the Senate with bipartisan support in the House, and it does so as a result of the leadership of the ranking member, Jim Haines. I appreciate his commitment to both declassifying information, to the importance of this information concerning COVID-19, and for the fact that we are working in a bipartisan manner to do so. This will be a very strong statement from this House today that we want to know the origins of COVID-19. The American public deserve to know the answers, and that we are moving to declassify the information that we have available. With that, I ask for support of Senate Bill 619 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 199, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
An act to require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information relating to the origin of COVID-19 and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye.